Right now, Europe isn't just facing another heat wave. It's facing a pattern that's quite literally tearing the continent's weather in half, trapping scorching or record-breaking heat directly between two separate storm systems. While millions of people sit caught in the crossfire between blistering temperatures on one side and violent, damaging storms on the other. Stick around, because I'm about to walk you through exactly what meteorologists are calling this pattern, why it's splitting Europe's means if you live anywhere from Iberia to the Baltics over the coming days. And hit subscribe now, because this channel breaks down real weather events without the exaggeration, and this particular pattern is still very much unfolding. Let's start with the phenomenon actually driving all of this, because understanding the mechanism explains everything else. Meteorologists have named this pattern an omega block, and the name comes directly from the shape it forms when mapped across the atmosphere, closely resembling the Greek letter omega. According to Samantha Burgess, a researcher with the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, an omega block essentially creates the equivalent of a traffic jam in the atmosphere, locking heat in place for days or even weeks at a time. Here's exactly how that traffic jam forms. A ridge of high pressure builds up and pulls hot air northward, in this case originating from North Africa, then gets wedged directly between two separate areas of low pressure, one typically sitting off the coast of Portugal in the Atlantic, and the other parked over Central Europe. That high pressure ridge, trapped between two low pressure systems on either side, is what physically carves the letter-shaped pattern into the atmosphere. And because high pressure systems block the normal west to east flow of weather that usually keeps conditions changing and moving along, the entire pattern essentially grinds to a halt, sitting in place far longer than a typical summer weather system ever would. To understand why that stalling matters so much, it helps to compare it to how weather normally behaves across the middle latitudes where most of Europe sits. Under typical conditions, the jet stream, a fast-moving river of air high in the atmosphere, steers weather systems from west to east in a fairly predictable, continuous rhythm, meaning a hot spell in one location usually gets replaced by cooler, more changeable conditions within a matter of days as the next system moves through. An omega block essentially breaks that rhythm entirely. The jet stream gets forced into a sharp northward bulge around the high-pressure ridge, then dips back down on either side around the two low-pressure troughs, creating a shape on weather maps that genuinely does resemble the Greek letter it's named after. Once that shape locks into place, the systems on either side of it can remain almost completely stationary for a week or more, which is exactly why this particular pattern produces such prolonged, punishing heat rather than the shorter, few-day hot spells that more typical summer weather usually delivers. This is exactly where the splitting effect comes from. The core of the omega block, sitting directly under that high-pressure ridge, experiences exactly what you'd expect: sinking air, minimal cloud cover, and relentless, building heat with essentially no relief in sight. But on either side of that ridge, where the two low-pressure troughs sit, conditions look completely different. Those low-pressure zones tend to pull in cooler, more unstable air, setting up the ingredients for violent thunderstorms, large hail, damaging winds, and flash flooding right along the edges of the heat dome, even as the core just a few hundred miles away continues baking under clear skies and climbing temperatures. If you're the kind of person who wants weather patterns explained clearly instead of buried in jargon, go ahead and drop a like on this video right now, because it genuinely helps this kind of content reach more people who need it. Now, let's talk about just how extreme this year's version of the pattern has actually gotten, because the numbers are genuinely record-breaking. France recorded its highest temperature since national records began in 1947, with the mercury hitting 44.3 degrees Celsius, roughly 112 degrees Fahrenheit. The country posted a national average temperature of 30 degrees Celsius across an entire day, an almost unheard of figure when you consider that number includes cooler coastal regions and higher elevation areas averaged in alongside the hottest inland zones. National weather services from Berlin to Prague issued red alerts for extreme fire danger, as erratic wind shifts combined with extremely low humidity created conditions where even a small spark could rapidly spiral into an uncontrollable wildfire. The human toll has been severe and, in some cases, genuinely shocking. More than 40 people drowned across France in a single week, largely after seeking relief from the heat in unsupervised bodies of water, rivers, lakes, and ponds without lifeguards or safety infrastructure in place. Thousands of homes lost electricity as air conditioning demand pushed regional power grids well past their normal summer load. And multiple nuclear power plants in France and Switzerland were forced to reduce output or shut down entirely, since the river water normally used to cool. These facilities had itself become too warm to safely handle the job. That nuclear power detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it illustrates just how far-reaching the consequences of this kind of sustained heat event can be. Nuclear plants rely on drawing in river or seawater to cool their reactors, then release that water back into the environment at a regulated, safe temperature to protect local ecosystems downstream. When the river water itself is already running unusually warm before it ever reaches the plant, operators face a difficult choice. Either reduce power output to limit how much additional heat gets added to the water, or risk releasing water back into already stressed river ecosystems at temperatures that could seriously harm fish and other aquatic life. Multiple facilities in France and Switzerland chose to scale back operations rather than take that risk. G further strained to power grids already struggling to meet record-breaking air conditioning demand during the very same stretch. Here's the detail that tends to stop people in their tracks once they hear it explained properly. This isn't Europe's first omega block of the summer, and forecasters don't expect it to be the last. A first major heat dome, driven by this same basic pattern, struck in late June, breaking hundreds of local and national temperature records across France, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Germany before finally beginning to shift. Then, rather than the continent getting a genuine lasting break, forecast models pointed almost immediately toward a second heat dome building by early July, with the most dangerous phase expected to spread from Spain, Portugal, and southwest France around July 7th and 8th, deeper into France, Benelux, Germany, and the Alps by July 9th through 11th, and potentially stalling in place through July 12th to 14th if the blocking pattern held firm the way forecasters expected. That back-to-back pattern matters enormously for how dangerous each successive heat wave actually becomes. The first heat wave already dried out soils and heated up buildings, roads, and entire cities down to their foundations. With less moisture left in the ground to evaporate and naturally cool the surface, meteorologists warned the second wave was likely to heat up even faster than the first, since evaporative cooling, one of the atmosphere's natural defenses against extreme heat, simply had less water left to work with. If you found this as useful as I hope, drop a comment letting me know which part of Europe you're watching this from, because it genuinely helps me figure out which regional weather stories are worth digging into next. Now let's talk about what happens at the edges of this pattern, because that's really where the millions caught in the middle framing comes from. As the omega block stalls and recycles hot air through its core, the boundary zones along its northern and eastern edges become breeding grounds for genuinely severe thunderstorm activity. These storms can bring large hail capable of damaging cars and crops, damaging straight-line winds strong enough to bring down trees and power lines, and flash flooding intense enough to overwhelm drainage systems in cities that spent the previous week baking under record heat with barely a drop of rain. This creates a genuinely difficult situation for emergency planners and ordinary residents alike. A region can go from issuing extreme heat warnings and wildfire danger alerts one day to flash flood warnings and severe thunderstorm watches within 48 hours, as the boundary of the omega block shifts even slightly. And because the ground has already been baked hard and dry by the preceding heat, when heavy rain finally does arrive along these boundary zones, it often runs off rapidly rather than soaking into parched, compacted soil, increasing the flash flooding risk even further. This whiplash effect, rapid shifts between contrasting weather extremes, such as intense heat, followed almost immediately by heavy rainfall or severe storms, has become something meteorologists specifically watch for whenever an omega block sets up over a populated region. It's not simply an inconvenience. Infrastructure and emergency response systems built around handling one type of extreme weather at a time can struggle when a heat emergency transitions almost overnight into a flooding emergency in the exact same communities, particularly when both events strike within the same week, and stretch already limited emergency resources across two very different types of crisis response. It's worth understanding why this specific atmospheric pattern has become such a recurring feature of recent European summers, rather than a rare one-off event. Scientists have not reached a firm consensus on whether climate change is directly making omega blocks more frequent, and that remains a genuinely open, actively researched question. What is far more settled, according to researchers like Burgess, is that climate change is making the heat these blocking patterns generate substantially more dangerous once they do form. Human-driven warming has raised the planet's baseline global temperature by roughly 1.3 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. When an omega block locks hot air in place over a region, that heat now builds from an already elevated starting point, pushing peak temperatures higher than an identical weather pattern would have produced decades ago. Researchers estimate that today's European heat waves are now running somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius, hotter than they would have been without human-caused emissions layered into the underlying climate. That baseline shift helps explain a pattern that's become increasingly familiar to anyone following European weather over the past several summers. Back in 2022, heat waves across the continent were linked to tens of thousands of deaths and roughly $40 billion in damages. In 2023, a heat wave later nicknamed the Cerberus event, after the mythological hound of the underworld, brought some of the hottest temperatures ever recorded in Europe and was tied to more than 47,000 deaths across the continent that year. Reports on the 2024 heat season found similarly severe totals, with researchers documenting well over 62,000 heat-related deaths across Europe that year alone. Each of these previous events shared the same basic underlying driver, a stalled, high-pressure blocking, pattern-trapping heat in place over an already warming continent. And this year's back-to-back omega blocks appear to be following that same increasingly familiar, increasingly dangerous script. This isn't the first time an omega block has driven a major European heat crisis either. A horseshoe-shaped omega pattern was identified as the key driver behind a major hot spell that struck France back in June 2025, and similar blocking patterns have appeared repeatedly in recent summers across Europe. Researchers note that these atmospheric blocking patterns aren't unique to Europe at all. The same basic phenomenon occurs over the Pacific and over North America as well, wherever the right combination of high and low pressure systems happens to line up and stall the normal eastward flow of weather. What has changed, according to climate scientists, is that there's been a measurable increase in these kinds of high-pressure blocking systems developing over Europe specifically in recent decades, even as researchers continue debating exactly how much of that increase can be directly tied to broader climate change versus natural year-to-year atmospheric variability. Public health officials across the affected countries have been direct and urgent in their guidance throughout this stretch, with overnight temperatures failing to drop enough to give bodies genuine relief between consecutive scorching days. The same pattern of compounding heat stress that has driven fatalities in previous European heat waves has been front and center in official warnings this time as well. Libraries, museums, cinemas, and other air-conditioned public buildings have been opened as designated cooling centers in multiple countries, giving residents without reliable air conditioning at home somewhere safe to spend the hottest parts of the day. This kind of overnight heat retention matters more than people often assume. Air conditioning penetration across much of Europe remains significantly lower than in regions like North America, since European building design historically prioritized retaining heat during cold winters rather than shedding it during hot summers, an approach that worked reasonably well for decades, but has become an increasing liability as summer heat waves have grown more frequent and more extreme. Older apartment buildings in particular, especially those built from thick masonry designed to hold warmth through winter, can trap daytime heat inside for days at a time, meaning indoor temperatures sometimes barely drop even overnight, leaving residents, especially elderly people living alone, with essentially no opportunity to physically recover before the next day's heat begins building all over again. There's an additional layer to this pattern that doesn't always make headlines the way the heat and storms do. Omega blocks, pulling air up from North Africa, frequently carry Saharan dust along with them, and this year has been no exception. That dust has drifted across Spain, Portugal, and further north into parts of Western and Central Europe, degrading air quality in cities that were already struggling with heat-related health warnings. For anyone with asthma or other respiratory conditions, the combination of extreme heat, high humidity in some regions, and dust-laden air adds yet another layer of risk during an already difficult stretch, and health officials in several countries have specifically flagged the compounded danger of these overlapping hazards. If you've made it this far, here's the wider context worth keeping in mind. Meteorologists tracking this pattern have been careful to note that the exact dates, temperature peaks, and duration of the second heat dome remain forecast scenarios rather than locked-in certainties, since blocking patterns like this one can shift, weaken, or occasionally strengthen further than initial models suggest as new data comes in day by day. That's part of why forecasters have repeatedly emphasized checking daily updates rather than relying on a single forecast issued a week or more in advance, since the exact boundary between the scorching core and the stormy edges of an omega block can move meaningfully within just a day or two as the broader pattern evolves. So what does the coming stretch actually look like for the roughly 100 million people living across the countries directly affected by this pattern? Forecasters expect conditions to begin gradually easing only once the omega block itself finally weakens and the jet stream resumes its normal west-to-east movement, pushing the stalled ridge of high pressure out of place and allowing more typical, changeable summer weather to return. Until that shift happens, the pattern described throughout this video, scorching, record-challenging heat locked directly over the continent's core, flanked by increasingly volatile, storm-prone boundary zones on either side, is expected to remain the dominant feature of European weather. That's really the core of why this pattern deserves the attention it's getting right now. It isn't simply another hot summer stretch. It's a genuinely unusual atmospheric configuration, splitting the continent's weather into two starkly different experiences, depending on exactly where you happen to be standing, with millions of people across multiple countries caught directly in the transition zones between one of the most extreme heat events in France's recorded history and the increasingly severe storms forming right along its edges. Wildfire risk remains one of the most immediate concerns tied to this pattern as well, particularly across southern France, Spain, Portugal, and parts of the Balkans. where dry vegetation left over from earlier in the summer combines with the current heat and low humidity to create ideal conditions for fires to ignite and spread rapidly. Firefighting resources across multiple countries have already been stretched thin, responding to blazes linked to the earlier June heat dome. And forecasters have specifically warned that a repeat, or worse, remains a genuine possibility if the second wave builds as strongly as current models suggest, especially in areas where erratic wind shifts along the boundary of the Omega Block could rapidly change a fire's direction with little warning. If weather stories like this, grounded in what meteorologists and climate researchers are actually saying rather than exaggerated headlines, are what you want more of, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because this pattern is still actively evolving, and there's a real chance the next update brings meaningful changes to how it plays out across the continent. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.